Hello viewers, thank you for joining me. I'm coming up on the end of the sudden string of requests I got a few months back, and to be totally honest, this is the one I was a little nervous about. Well, maybe nervous isn't quite the right word, it just required the most preparation. This is the first Gundam anime I've ever seen, but the franchise is one I've been hearing about since I don't even know when I first took notice of it. But it's been successful for much longer than I've been alive. Anything with a long history can be a little daunting. It's very possible that I never would have jumped into it at any point had Ninjammer 726 not pushed me to, so I appreciate that. And someone else left me a wonderfully long, detailed comment writing out where all the Gundam series fall, when they aired, which ones are connected, and that sort of thing, and I really appreciated that. Particularly because it assured me that most of them can be viewed in any order, which was my first concern. As far as I'm aware, Iron-Blooded Orphans is still the most recent Gundam series to air, but it can definitely stand alone. So, there's my background, or lack thereof, with this series. All that's left is to warn you that there will be spoilers, and now we can really start. Iron-Blooded Orphans is set far in the future, 300 years after the Calamity War, which is basically society's marker for when things shifted from the past era to the current one. To be honest, the details of the war itself and why it was fought have been pretty vague so far. Probably a good time to mention I am splitting this series in half and hoping some things will be expanded on a bit more in Season 2. But from what I've gathered so far, humanity had already migrated to space 300 years ago, and Earth was fighting the space colonies for control over the AHAP reactors, which are specifically used to power mobile suits, the giant robots for anyone even more uninitiated than I was, and create artificial gravity, that sort of thing, but which I'm sure have a lot more versatility as just an energy source in general. As it's kind of just a barely touched upon backdrop for this story, I think it's safe to say it was yet another war for resources and leave it at that. Anyway, the military organization Gallarhorn was created to deal with this threat, and in turn developed 72 Gundam frames, which were more advanced and powerful than any of the mobile suits currently in use. This was paired with their other invention, the Alea Vignana system. This system is surgically implanted into a person's spine when they're young and grows with them and allows them to literally plug themselves into the machine. It's usually advertised as an enhancement to their spatial awareness when piloting their mechs, but it does a lot more than that. As they grow, the Alea Vignana system alters its user's brain so that it can process their mobile suit's data directly. It basically makes them one with the machine, and one of the biggest advantages of this system is that it allows uneducated, untrained pilots to manipulate their mobile suits with ease. This will be especially important, as most of our heroes are young kids who never even learn to read. Of course, it's also worth noting that its negative effects can potentially be lethal. Couple this with the point that, due to how the system has to grow with its pilot, it necessitates performing the procedure on young children, and it's not hard to understand why, in current times, the Alea Vignana system is seen as a barbaric relic of the past, and the people who have it done are seen as less than human. But 300 years ago, it was these two developments that allowed Gallarhorn to end the war in Earth's favor. When the fighting stopped, the planet was divided up into 4 major economic blocks, which were then each given a space colony to preside over and basically run their businesses through. But this method only helps the people on Earth. Most of the people on the colonies have since been living under harsh, impoverished conditions. Meanwhile, Gallarhorn stuck around as, well, the intention was a neutral space police force, but these days the organization is basically a breeding ground for bribery and corruption. Our story starts in the Crise district on Mars, at a military base that's primarily maintained and kept running by Alea Vignana implanted children, who are treated terribly, by the way. The machines they operate get more respect. To be honest, this show does a great job of, let's call it, appreciating their minor characters. They have just as much personality and screen time as the main crew, but if I had to pick two who felt like they were meant to be the main protagonists, it would be Orga and Mikazuki, childhood friends who've been fighting back against the injustices of their society for a long time. But I'll get into the specifics of their characters a little later. All you really need to know for the basics is that Orga's the leader of pretty much every group he's a part of ever, and Mika's their ace pilot. The story really starts with Kudelia Ina Bernstein, a girl about their age from a very well-off, important family who's been campaigning for Martian independence. At the start of the story, she's actually had some success with the Prime Minister of the region in charge of Mars, who's agreed to meet with her and negotiate, and she's hired Orga and Mikazuki's unit to escort and guard her to Earth. One thing I really appreciated from the start was the grasp the writers had on the kids' mindsets. They're just as cynical and angry and beaten down as they should be, living the lives they have. Even though Kudelia is fighting for things that would improve those lives, they're not exactly jumping to support her. They're not in a place where they can dare to hope for that just yet. They're mostly just suspicious that their group would be assigned to something so important. They're not all that high up on the totem pole and always seem to be getting in trouble for something, and they're right to be suspicious. However unjust it might be, Earth got the better end of this deal in the current society, which means it's in their best interests for Kudelia not to make it to their planet and negotiate with anyone who has the power to change the current rule. And as all the wealth currently resides on Earth, Gallarhorn is protecting their interests above all else. So Kudelia isn't at the base for long before it's attacked, and the rest of their superiors use Orga's group as bait, sacrificing them and Kudelia to save themselves. It's a pretty clear status quo from the start. No one messes with Gallarhorn. Except then the unthinkable happens. The base had an old Gundam frame which they fix up in time for Mikazuki to turn the tide of the battle. The attacking force was hardly expecting a bunch of kids to fight back at all, and his Alea Vignana system gives him the edge he needs to actually overpower them and win. When the base's leaders return, Orga and the survivors from his unit use their newfound power to lead a mutiny, claiming the base as their own. They rename their company Tekkadan, the Iron Flower, because it never wilts or dies, and agree to take on Kudelia's escort mission as their first official job. This is most of the story, the crew overcoming various ordeals as they guide Kudelia to Earth. Of course, to leave it at that would make any review of a second season totally incomprehensible. Story-wise, we're only like 4 episodes in, but I feel like this should finally give you enough background to talk about the characters a bit more. I kind of feel like I should start with Kudelia, but that's going to lead us right back into the story, so I'll start with Orga, the leader, and it's kind of impossible to talk about Orga without talking about Mika. It's not exactly that they're joined at the hip, it's more that they depend on each other for a lot more than they depend on their other friends. I'd call them best friends and leave it at that, but that doesn't sound quite right either. The bottom line is that Mika will do anything Orga asks him to, which could be a bit of a problem for Orga's character, honestly. Don't get me wrong, he's perfectly likable. He proves he's got a mind for strategy in their very first battle, and the other kids already respected and looked up to him, so it feels natural that they'd start taking orders from him. There was just something missing for me. There's this one scene, something that Orga and Mika experienced when they were younger, that the series flashes back to over and over and over again. But the full story of that day has not been explored in these first 25 episodes, and I'll be really disappointed if they don't go a little deeper into it. The gist is that it was some major moment in their lives where they fought back against their circumstances. And at the end of it, Orga promises Mika that there has to be a better place out there somewhere, and that they'll find it together someday, which is what's really driving Mika now. I guess I was just looking for something specific in his backstory that established Orga as the leader, because it's a lot of pressure once all their lives are in his hands, which is something he struggles with a little throughout the series, but that position of leader is usually something you get to see a character grow into, and Orga's already effectively got that role at the very start of the series. In general, he is a very likable character. He just feels like he's kind of a stagnant character. I would have liked to see him falter a little more. He has a few moments where he questions his path, but they're never seriously derailed by Orga doubting himself or anything. He always manages to pull himself together just in time for it to never really affect the plot. Like, he's inexperienced, but doesn't make any major mistakes. It made him a little dull as a character, honestly. It sounds kinda crazy to follow that up with saying Mika had more personality. Any of you who've seen even a single episode probably reacted to that with an incredulous look. Mikazuki is one of those characters who's stoic to the extreme. He exhibits very little emotion. You know, I've been trying not to make too many comparisons between the shows, but a lot of aspects of Iron-Blooded Orphans reminded me of Old Noah Zero. I think where that works most in its favor is with the main protagonists. Mika feels like a stoic, socially awkward type character done right. More often than not, Inaho just seemed bored. Even in the middle of battle. Even in that one scene where he literally watches his friend die right in front of him. Mikazuki didn't emote much. I read him as the kind of character who's just totally blind to all social cues, but I never got the impression he didn't care. In fact, everything Mika says and does is one reminder after another how much he values the other members of Tekkadan. For a lot of them, Tekkadan is the only family they have, and they're all willing to risk their lives to protect that. Mika has a few moments, usually in response to watching one of his friends fall in battle, where he starts to seem a bit unhinged, maybe a little too into the violence, and there is one encounter that makes him question that, something I hope they address a little more in Season 2. But mostly, he remains very level-headed in battle, very mission-oriented. His mindset seems to boil down to, just tell me who to kill and I'll do it. Returning to that blindness to social cues point, he actually has a few moments I really loved, where he cuts off an enemy mid-speech because, hello, this is a battle. We're here to fight, not give big anime monologues. It added a touch of humor in places that may not have been entirely intentional, but which fit the overall tone of this show really well, which I'll come back to later. If there's one thing I wasn't crazy about with Mikazuki, it's that he doesn't often seem to have a mind of his own, but mostly this could be more a problem for Orga than Mika, because this series really does try to push that they depend on each other, and that works in some cases. Orga seems empowered by the faith Mikazuki has in him, but they also stress that Orga values Mika's opinions. There are just a few scenes that didn't sit right with me, where there's some big decision to be made and Orga's being questioned, and his final straw is, well, if Mika also has a problem with it, then I'll change my mind. Because he has to be aware that Mika goes along with everything he decides. It kind of goes back to the other problem I have with Orga right now. The dynamics of that relationship are just already so established by episode 1. I really think some of these problems would be smoothed over if we were given a little more backstory. But that's one problem that the last member of our little main trio, at least, doesn't have. I don't think anyone grows more throughout the course of Iron-Blooded Orphans than Kudelia. It really stood out to me that when she first arrived, none of the kids she was aiming to help were really excited to see her. Excited about a chance to travel and maybe see Earth, but not really about why they were bringing her. At least, no one really had faith she could do what she was aiming to, and they weren't wrong to doubt. Kudelia had great intentions, but was very young and a little naive, and grew up very privileged. She only ever saw the harsh realities of Martian society in brief snatches. But she also knows that she's got a lot to learn, and she's always trying to improve herself. She handpicked this unit as her escort because she knew it was made up of kids who represented and had to experience the worst parts of the current rule. so she always perseveres, even when she doesn't receive the warmest welcome. Kudelia has a lot of ups and downs in the first half of Season 1. She's just constantly swinging between pushing herself forward and falling into these pits of self-loathing. It dragged on a little too long for me. She just makes a lot of the same points over and over again. She laments about feeling powerless, goes through another big moment or battle, and then goes right back to hating herself for not having all the answers and the power to fix everything. She was always admirable to me. She never got on my nerves too much, even in her lowest moments, and as the season went on, it became clear that she didn't even really understand the scope of her own influence. On their way to Earth, they stop at a collection of space colonies, and on these colonies they find even more people oppressed by Earth's policies. Except the workers here have been just waiting to revolt, and they expect Kudelia to lead them through a revolution. It goes back to the perspective thing. I had to keep reminding myself that Kudelia was not actually a princess, because she plays that princess-type role. A worker on these colonies even likens the members of Tekkadan to her band of knights. The only responsibility she has towards the Martian people is self-imposed, but when news that she's having even a little success gets out, she starts to become a symbol of hope for everyone being oppressed by Earth. And I think all the viewers were just waiting for the story to move in that direction. I know I was, at least. That's just the format. You start a series about an oppressed group of people, the story is usually about those people rebelling against it. But Kudelia's goals start out pretty small. Unfortunately, it takes a personal tragedy to really shift Kudelia's attitude. This whole time, she'd been accompanied by a woman named Fumitan. She'd been Kudelia's maid leading up to this journey, but it hardly feels right to describe her that way. Fumitan proves to have a whole variety of talents and knowledge as the journey gets underway. In the early days, I really don't know how they would have managed the ship without her, especially during the chaos of the battles. And all these hidden talents did raise some suspicion, and rightfully so. Fumitan was basically acting as an informant, and it's revealed that she always secretly resented Kudelia for being so naive and innocent. Just a spoiled little rich girl taking pity on the kids in Tekkadan. Kids who'd grown up like Fumitan had. But at the same time, there was no one Kudelia trusted more. She viewed Fumitan like an older sister, and Fumitan couldn't help growing to care for her as well. Kudelia gets caught up in the colony's rebellion, which Gallarhorn had been anticipating and manipulated as an excuse to massacre all the protesters. Even at this point, surrounded by the bodies of the people who'd been basically worshipping her arrival, Kudelia still just looks horrified and confused and innocent. But that finally dies when Fumitan sacrifices herself to save her. There were some really striking scenes in Iron-Blooded Orphans, and watching Mikazuki have to pull her out from underneath Fumitan's body was definitely one of them. From this point on, Kudelia's outlook is a lot harsher. She still has some quiet moments where she allows herself to doubt, but you can see her stow away that side of her mind anytime she's not alone. She's more motivated to help people than ever, accepting that she may have to lead an actual revolution, and she's just very all business from here on out. It was equally sad and empowering to watch her finally take charge. We've gotta be 20 minutes in by now, and it still feels like I've barely scratched the surface. Iron-Blooded Orphans had so many interesting characters from every side of this conflict. I'd definitely be remiss not to mention the main two from Gallarhorn because they highlight multiple aspects of this story. The biggest one for me is that our heroes do have the moral high ground, and not just because there's no excuse for treating the lower class the way they're treated in this universe. Gallarhorn is supposed to be keeping the peace, and instead they're acting in their own interests. We're introduced early on to Gaelio and McGillis, heirs to two of the original founding families of Gallarhorn. And they're proud of their history and involvement, but also a little disgusted with the current state of the organization. The idea of honor is really big in that social sphere. We meet another heir who really takes that to the extreme. She's one of the ones Mika just cuts off while she's formally challenging him to a duel, and it's kind of fantastic. Gaelio and McGillis want to reform Gallarhorn too, bring it back to a state they can be proud of. And that doesn't go quite how one of them planned, but I'll come back to that. The other big aspect of this series that the Gallarhorn characters really highlighted for me was the perception of age. It's a pretty big deal that these cruelties are being suffered by children. Everyone's always surprised at how young everyone in Tekkadan is. But the really young ones are primarily mechanics, not out on the front lines. The main crew all seem between the ages of, 15 and 18. Maybe it's just because I watch a lot of anime, where teenagers facing danger and saving the world and growing up too fast is just the norm, but there weren't a ton of scenes where I was struck by how young everyone was. I could mostly only appreciate it in contrast to other characters. The Gallarhorn heirs have grown up even more spoiled and privileged than Kudelia. There were definitely times when they seemed more like children than the Tekkadan kids. And then there's the matter of Ein. Ein was a young Gallarhorn recruit who really looked up to one of the soldiers who was killed in their very first battle back at the base. He slowly grows to be just completely taken over by his desire for revenge on Mikazuki, and it's really a shame. There's so much more that they could have done with him. Ein is half Martian, so he faces a lot of prejudice working for an Earth-based organization, and he can't be much older than the Tekkadan kids. It feels kind of negligent that there wasn't a single scene where he seemed to relate to them even a little, and I'm kinda mad that he was killed off already. For all the screen time he got, he feels like a very throwaway character who should have been important. But we do get a little of that from McGillis. His full background hasn't been revealed yet either, but we do know that he was adopted into the family he's the heir to, and it's suggested that his actual heritage is way down on that totem pole, possibly even Martian is my suspicion, which makes it even more of a slap in the face when he overthrows his father and usurps that position of Gallarhorn's overseer. McGillis basically double-crosses everyone he ever works with, and wherever Season 2's going, he's giving me distinct final villain feels. Which would be an interesting twist, because as of right now, things are going pretty great for our heroes. They got Kudelia to Earth and managed to get a prime minister elected who shares a lot of her views and has started negotiations, and with Gallarhorn under new rule, Tekkadan doesn't have to worry about being attacked on their way back to Mars. Which is where Season 1 leaves off. To be honest, it was kind of a weird place to me. I cannot even begin to describe how worried I am about things going downhill again in Season 2, because it kind of feels like this should be the very end. Gallarhorn's reformed, a better life for the people of Mars is underway, and while it does feel a little weird that there wasn't an actual full-scale war, I just know Season 2 is going to kill off someone else I really like, okay? I didn't even mention Biscuit. They raised like 6 death flags in 5 minutes, and I still couldn't believe they actually killed him off. But also, in a more objective sense, it would feel like a step back at this point, and I'm skeptical they could bring the story back around in that direction in a way that feels natural. There's just one more thing about this show that stood out to me that I want to talk about, and then finally end this review so I can go jump into the second season. If there was anything that did make me feel the kids' youth, it was the overall tone of this series. Don't get me wrong, there was a lot of drama with this build-up to a rebellion mindset, and there are some really intense battles. This show could be gritty when it wanted to, and it's certainly not afraid to pull that death trigger. They've already killed a few characters I thought important enough to have plot armor. But as a whole, Iron-Blooded Orphans could be a very feel-good show. They really push that Tekkadan has morphed from a bunch of friends or comrades to a real family, and I love that sort of thing. And they're not shy or subtle about it either. Sometimes dark shows like this one don't want to really delve into the mushy feelings, and I'm always on the side of a good friends-turned-pseudo-family story. And a story with a dark background is exactly where characters should embrace the good times when they can. Gallarhorn ruled all the official travel routes to Earth, so Tekkadan needed to ally themselves with another powerful group, which is how they become a part of Tewaz, which is basically the space mob. Specifically, they team up with the Turban family, and their leader sort of takes Orga under his wing. Naze was a little hard to get a read on. To be honest, I kept expecting him to reveal some hidden motive or double-cross them. It's been a big risk to support Tekkadan the way he has. They're kind of a magnet for trouble. But with everything else that's been resolved already, I have to believe it would have happened by now if it was going to, and that he really is genuine, which adds to the uplifting feeling I get from this show. And finally, I have to stress again how much this series appreciates its minor characters. To be honest, I'm still learning a lot of their names, because I figured they couldn't be nearly as important as the main crew, but it really does feel like everyone's story. They've all got so much personality and their own talents and little motivations that make up the whole. I'm definitely going to have to rewatch this first season once I'm done with the whole series, because I know there were things I didn't fully appreciate the first time. Thank you again, Ninjammer726, for recommending me this series. I know I was a little apprehensive at first, but I'm really liking it so far. I'm excited to see what comes next, and just hoping it doesn't leave me totally heartbroken. Thank you for watching.